14. And of course, just as again a reminder of the three primary outlines of our book dealing with Samuel and now with Saul, and a little bit later we'll get into David. In this particular chapter, we're going to divide it just into two particular parts, and that's going to be dealing with Saul's fight and Saul's fall. Now, that's quite a bit's going to happen in this one chapter. Chapter 13, verses 1 through 23. Last week, well, I should say 2 weeks ago, we left Saul being affirmed as king and having slain the Ammonites and Nahash, their king. They had threatened the men in the city of Jabesh Gilead. And then in chapter 12, we were able to look at and find Samuel, what a lot of people call his farewell speech, but I don't call it his farewell speech unless you're going to restrict that to farewell as the judge, because that's all that it is. Because Samuel is very much alive and going on strong throughout most of the remainder of this particular book. But it was his formal statement about a change and his charge of this change of government from a theocracy to a monarchy. Now we begin in chapter 13, and right off in the first verse, we're going to talk about in the first 2 years. So I said, it doesn't take very long. It says Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereof 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin, and the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. Now, again, it's amazing how many people are confused by simple English words, where it says Saul reigned 1 year, and then when he had reigned 2 years, this is what happened. So I say that because you wouldn't believe the things that people will say, well, this is, really talking about 10 and 20 years, because what we learn is that Saul had been anointed by Samuel, and we saw that all of the events that took place in that first year, which were really not much, because he went home. And then when the Ammonites, when Nahash had come out and they were calling for the men of Jabesh Gilead, called for their king to come deliver them, that's exactly what happened. And then when he had reigned for 2 years, he's kind of ready to take control of the Philistines. But it's interesting. If you notice, it says Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel. Of course, 2,000 were with him, 1,000 went with Jonathan, and the rest of the people, what did he do? He sent every man to his tent. You remember how many did he raise as an army prior to this when they fought the Ammonites? It was 300,000. Now they're going to deal with 3,000. There were so many men, and you think about this, 297,000 men were dismissed. Well, he divided the numbers. Some went with Jonathan. This tells you again, Jonathan's not a baby, not a little kid. He's a young man leading an army of 1,000 men. And what happens? What takes place? Well, we see what happens. They divided this up. Verse 3, it says, and Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba. Now, a garrison, just so you know, was the idea of a fortified military base, if you will. So it's an ordered group of military men that are located in this particular area. It doesn't mean that it was a castle with moats. It's talking about the men. It's talking about their weaponry. It's talking about how that they were fortified, that they had their armaments that were there. In fact, you'll see a little bit later, they made sure that Israel had no armaments and had no ability to have armaments that were here. So this garrison is a permanent military outpost, a fortified post of the Philistines, and it was a very aggressive move on the part of Jonathan to do what he did. And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. And Saul blew the trumpet through all the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." Well, everybody has now heard about it. And in fact, what you'll see in verse 4 is that he's telling them, prepare for war. Well, why is he telling them to prepare for war? Because the Philistines heard it, and they're preparing for war. All Israel heard say that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel also had an abomination with the Philistines. In other words, Philistines are angry. Philistines are mad. Philistines are quite upset that Israel has done this, that they've taken away that fortification. And the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal. Well, I think they're pretty excited after hearing all of this. Our new king is destroying the Philistines and their control of an area that's here. So the people are getting ready to gather together to fight and make ready for war under King Saul. But the problem is that they also stirred up a hornet's nest. The mighty enemy, the Philistines, gathered themselves together to fight with Israel. 30,000 chariots. Now again, I can't help it. When I read, again, try to read several commentaries after I've put my notes together, and because I don't want to be influenced too much. The reason why is because most of them, there's no way this was 30,000 chariots. No way this was 6,000 horsemen and people as the sand. Well, why not? Why do you say that? God said it, so I happen to believe it. And I think that's why when you read this, they had 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen. That's talking about a cavalry that's quite well equipped, and people as the sand, which is on the seashore in multitude, and they came up and pitched in Michmash. Well, isn't that where Saul just was? At whatever he's talking about, it was indeed eastward from Bethaven. So the Philistines showed up in huge numbers with great weaponry. This was a military battle, and the Pharisees were prepared to fight the Philistines were prepared to fight a military battle. Israel was not prepared. So what happened? Against all these, we can call them in their days, technological advances, they had chariots. They probably not only had chariots, but they had wagons, support vehicles. They had people that were there to support them, and they were organized. And so, verse 6, what happens? When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, that's what they said. For the people were distressed. Then the people did hide themselves in caves and thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. I mean, they were running for cover. The destruction of that garrison was like killing a few hornets. You kill a few hornets only to find out that there's a whole nest, and the whole nest has just arrived. That's why this next section, you have the trembling warriors, and you'll see this. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. So we've got a bunch of them running for the hills, hiding in the caves, hiding anywhere they can hide. And a whole bunch of the other ones are running across the Jordan River to get on the side where the half-tribe of Manasseh and Gad are on the other side. And as for Saul, it says he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. That's the kind of military might that he's got. He's got warriors that are scared out of their wits. They're shaking in their boots. So here we've got all of this. Now it sets the scene for what you're going to read next, which is really the most impactful passage in this whole story. And that's this. We're going to look a little bit at the impatient king. And he tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. In other words, Samuel had told him, and you can go back to chapter 10 and verse 8 and read that, all the way back there where Samuel told him, look, I want you to go to Gilgal, I want you to wait there, and I'm going to come down and offer burnt offering and peace offering. You wait for me. You stay there until I arrive. But what happened? Samuel didn't come, not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So all of a sudden, everybody, including Saul, gets nervous. He hasn't arrived as he said he would, but I'm going to remind you of the words that God said about Samuel. And that is that none of the words, none of the promises that he ever gave, none of the words that he ever said, did any of his words fall to the ground. That's important to understand. Saul knew that as well. But he got nervous. He got frightened. The Philistines are getting closer. Saul is outnumbered and outgunned. His people are thinking of self-preservation, so they're scattering, they're hiding, they're running for the hills. Samuel was supposed to, again, offer the offerings and then tell him what he was supposed to do. That's what he told him. He says, I'll come down, offer the burnt offering and the peace offering, and then I'll tell you what you're supposed to do. You're going to get some divine guidance. Well, where's Samuel? The Philistines are coming. Samuel is nowhere in sight, and I don't know what to do. I know what to do. Here's what I'll do. Verse 9, and Saul said, bring hither a burnt offering to me and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. Now, it took a little time for them to get together, the animals, whether it was the bullocks, the goat, the sheep, whatever it might have been that was there that he offered or brought that. But as they did, all of a sudden he offers the burnt offering. Then verse 10, and it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him. Now, can you just get the picture here a little bit that he might salute him? Don't pay any attention to what I was doing. He's running out away from what had just happened and what he had just done because he already knows he blew it. And he comes out to meet him. Saul took matters into his own hands. He can't wait. And the people, he thinks, need to see him acting like a king. So Saul gives those orders. He forgets, though, that it's not just the appropriate animals and the appropriate offerings, but there's an appropriate person to offer the burnt offering and the peace offering, and he ain't it. Now, you can go back in the Old Testament, you can find that others were allowed to bring a burnt offering besides the priest. Saul, though, was instructed specifically to wait until Samuel arrived, and Samuel, as the high priest, as the priest, would offer those offerings. So Saul invaded the office of the priest when he did this, but he did more than just that. Verse 10, again, and then 11, and verse 11, Samuel said, what hast thou done? What have you done? And Saul said, because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed. Yeah, well, you didn't wait till the end of the day. That day started, but the day hadn't ended. Samuel did get there at the appointed time, and the Philistines gathered themselves together. So all of these things, in other words, the circumstances required or justified my actions. Now, think about it, because a lot of times that's exactly what we do. We justify our actions even though we know we shouldn't be going there. We shouldn't be doing that. In verse 12, we see, therefore said I, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I just wanted to make supplication. I just wanted to worship the Lord. I just wanted to do all these things just right because, and notice this. I have not made supplication unto the Lord, so I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. Yeah, and you were going to offer a peace offering too if I hadn't showed up at the right time. I forced myself. I didn't want to do it, but I made myself. Now think about that, if you will. I made myself to act against my will. Huh? That's pretty much what he's saying. I made myself to act against my will. That doesn't make any sense. I just had to. The circumstances required it. The leadership position required I step up and do this. But what is he going to find out? This was not a minor or a small mistake. What do we see? This impatient king, and Samuel said to Saul, thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. But here's the part. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. That's not going to happen. Monarchy is going to be taken from your family and given to another family. We think rather things, let's just put it this way. We think some sins are minor. We think some sins are small. But I will remind you that Adam just took a piece of fruit. That's all he did. Uzzah, the driver of the ox cart, only reached out to steady the ark as it was wobbling. That's all he did. But he was killed because he touched the ark. The New Testament tells us that a little leaven leavens the whole lump. This was a costly sin. We know the song, that says that sin will take you farther than you wanted to go, make you pay more than you wanted to, keep you longer than you wanted to stay. Once when I was driving along in Mississippi with Brother Fayard after being picked up from the airport, and we were driving along quite a distance and along the freeway, and I kept noticing this vine, a plant that was growing all along the sides of the freeway and up into the trees, and you could just see it was covering everywhere. And I said, what is that? And he says, it's kudzu. And I said, well, man, that's a lot. He says, yep. He says, it's not native to this area. Somebody decided they would bring it in to help keep the ground from being destroyed. And now kudzu is everywhere and taking over and killing all kinds of other things. That's like sin. You think it might be okay, but it's not. And what do we see? The lost kingdom. Next in verse 14, but now thy kingdom shall not continue. That doesn't mean that Israel's going to no longer exist. That meant his monarchy would no longer exist. Then he says this, and pay attention to this, because now, remember, what do we have? 2 years of Saul's reign. During the second year, he fouls up enough to destroy his kingdom, ever surviving past him. Now, Saul ended up reigning for some 40 years. But his kingdom ended in just a little while when David is anointed. David is certainly not going to, as he said over and over again, he would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. he would let God take care of that, and he did. He bided his time. He waited. Unlike King Saul, David had two particular times of opportunity to be able to slay Saul in rather easy format, and he did not do it. He waited upon the Lord. In fact, if you read through the Psalms, you will find, now I've forgotten, but I think it's 19 different Psalms that if he doesn't say it exactly this way, he gives you the information, wait on the Lord. Wait, I say, on the Lord. And how often he would wait. In fact, we will find out that Saul will again do something that is disobedient to the Lord's commands. In chapter 15 and verse 11, God says this, it repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he has turned back from following me. This had to do with Agag. This had to do with the animals. He was supposed to slay everything and everyone. And he decided, well, you know what? There's some good-looking sheep. Man, those are some fine-looking cows over there. Can't kill them all. Well, that's where God said, it repenteth me that I've set up Saul to be king, for he's turned back from following me, hath not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried unto the Lord all night. Back to our verse 14. Again, because you haven't kept that which the Lord hath commanded thee, the kingdom is taken away from you. You and I don't know what we cost ourselves a lot of times by our disobedience. Now, you can read 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 10 about a young man. Well, he's not really a young man. He's a 40-year-old, they say. His name is Ishbosheth. He was one of Saul's sons. And he was made king. But Judah followed David. They did not choose him. What that whole matter is that God has chosen a man of a different quality. A man, it says, that was after God's own heart. And there is a distinct difference between the heart of Saul and the heart of David. And it only took 2 years for Saul to get arrogant and big-headed. Saul. So what do we have from there? God didn't choose a perfect man in David, but he chose a man who would confess his sins. Some not even right away, but still a man who would be convicted of his failures. Let me go on past that, verse 15, talking about a depleted army. And Samuel arose and gat him up from Gilgal unto Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people that were present with him. Remember a while ago it was 3,000? Now we're down to 600. We went from 300,000 to 3,000, and now we're all the way down to 600 men. And Saul and Jonathan his son and the people that were present with them abode in Gibeah of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped in Michmash. Then we read of the Philistine spoilers. Saul and his army didn't want to confront the Philistines, but the Philistines had a plan to play out from their primary encampments. The spoilers were raiders. They were people who would pillage and plunder and raid the surrounding cities and towns. And so the spoilers, it says, verse 17, came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned into the way that leadeth to Orpha, unto the land of Shuel. And verse 18, and another company turned the way to Beth Horon, and another company turned to the way of the border that looketh to the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. Now, all of a sudden, it's almost like you get a little parenthetical statement here in verse 19. Something worth noting, no swords, no spears, or at least not many. Now there was no smith found throughout all the land of Philistine, or Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears. Now, Philistines were kind of smart. They made sure they got rid of all the blacksmiths. They either tore them down, tore them out. They wouldn't allow them to operate, so that there was no way that they could make swords or spears. The only thing that they could do was to sharpen some of their things. Verse 20 says, but all the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen every man his share and his coulter and his axe and his mattocks. The only thing that they did have, they had a file for the mattocks and for the coulters and for the forks and for the axes and to sharpen the goads. So they could make a sharp point on some of these things, but they had to go clear down to the Philistines' camp to be able to find out and be able to get their weaponry. So, no arms, no swords, no spears. Well, there were a few of them, where they find out that in verse 22, so it came to pass in the day of battle, if there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people that were with Saul and Jonathan, but with Saul and with Jonathan his son was there found. They were the only ones that had the swords. People will ask, where'd they go? I don't know. But it tells you this is what they did. They were not really prepared. They had no weaponry. They faced an organized, fortified, weaponized group of soldiers. And they had basically nothing in their hands. The passage, really, when you begin to look at this, and they put it under enemy control. In verse 23, and the garrison of the Philistines went out to the passage of Michmash. In other words, they began to control the ins and the outs. They were making sure that no one could travel. So even though this section is about King Saul, Samuel is very much present in almost all of it to rebuke and to reprove the king and to tell him that he's lost the kingdom. Again, that's important to think about, because if he's lost the kingdom and he knows it, doesn't it make you know why he hates David so much? He figures out that David is the one that's been anointed, that David is the one that's going to be king, that David and his family is going to be the one to take the place. What a frightful series of events that has taken place so early in King Saul's reign. He knew that there was no hope without God's blessing upon him and his army. But he thought that he could bring those blessings upon himself and upon his army by his own actions. You can't do that. You can't shut or cut short the commands of God. You can't disobey them and think that somehow or another God will overlook that disobedience. Plain and simple, his problem was mentioned. It is disobedience. He failed to keep the commands of God. Samuel told him to wait, and he waited until he lost sight of God's power and he lost sight of God's providential hand. A lot of times you and I fail to wait just long enough because we lose sight of God's providential hand. Remember, there was a man who took his son up to Mount Moriah. He raised his arm all the way up into the air. At the last possible minute, if I could, the last possible second, God stopped him from slaying his son. Saul was tested and he failed because he could not wait. How do we do? Are we willing to wait on the Lord? There's no better, no greater lesson for us to learn than our need to wait upon God and to keep his commandments at all costs. Just like Abraham had to wait for that ram caught in a thicket or for the angel to tell him to stop, we need to wait even when the circumstances make us think that all hope is lost. We must wait on the Lord. All is never lost if we are trusting in God. Saul's fight was successful, but it was minor. Saul's fall was minor, but it was great. In that he failed in just a little thing he thought, but it was a huge fall indeed. Pray that's been a blessing.